a lot of his presentations in the past. He's also a very decent bloke as well. He just rang his mum before, just really cool. So please join me in welcoming Gregor.
Thanks, Helen. You couldn't resist. Thank you, Helen. I had to call my mum because it's her anniversary today. She's 49 years married. And I said, is it 47? And she said, well, if it was 47, your big sister would be a mistake. So, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Helen. And can I say thank you so much for the opportunity to present here today. Many of you would know that I'm a regular attender of ASCILITE. I've been a member of the society for many years, so it's lovely to be able to talk at the conference today. And of course it's a little bit daunting because I know you guys pretty well and you know me a little bit, and so giving a talk like this is really talking on your home turf. It's like talking to your family. And when there's family involved, there's always a danger that a little bit of mud will be slung. So I promise to be polite if you promise to be polite. But my brief from the organising committee, as Helen said, was understanding our present. And I'd like to say that I really think that the conference themes have been well thought out. And I relish the opportunity to think about the present and enjoy the past and look forward to the future. Also, the Electric Dreams theme I very much enjoy. I grew up with Electric Dreams. Not so much the film. I'm sure many of you went to the film last night. Not what I would regard as a classic of cinematography, but I certainly think that the music from the film is a bit of a classic. It represents for me something of the pinnacle of what's so good and so bad about 80s synth pop. I have vivid memories of being an 11-year-old sitting in my bedroom listening to 92.3 Eon FM, getting into the big electronic guitar solos on my bed, but that's probably a little bit too much information for you. So in preparing the talk, I was on understanding the present and thinking about Electric Dreams. I thought I'd focus the topic of the talk of the dream of educational technology interaction. And really to focus the content of the talk or the topic of the talk a little bit more, I really wanted to focus on a question to refine that focus. So the question that I wanted to talk about a little bit was, how well are we designing technology-based experiences to enhance and support teaching and learning interactions? And I suppose the first place to start on our interrogation of this question is to think about why interaction is important. And if we think about what drives a lot of our thinking, a lot of our research, a lot of our development, a lot of the way in which we talk about educational technology, the highest level of analysis is something associated with the theories or the frameworks or the rubrics that we use to guide our thinking in this area. So things that are well known to you in terms of constructivism, social constructivism, and the emerging framework of connectivism. And all of these frameworks sort of say to us that interaction is important in various different ways. And underneath those broad theories or frameworks or views or philosophies, whatever you want to call them, of educational technology, lie these more specific teaching and learning frameworks. So things like discovery-based learning, inquiry-based learning, role play, collaborative learning, and the like. And again, these models or frameworks tell us that the value of interaction in the teaching and learning process, and at the end of the day, they remind us that learning is a social process. It's a social process about involving interaction between people and interaction between a person and some sort of artefact. And often that interaction between people is mediated by an artefact. So that leads us to what is a widely known sort of taxonomy of interaction, of educational technology interaction. And I think one of the first people to arrive at this taxonomy that's up on the screen was Michael Moore when he was writing in an editorial for the American Journal of Distance Education. And I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about some of the theoretical components of this taxonomy. Learner-teacher interaction, learner-learner interaction, and learner-content interaction. So I want to learner-teacher interaction. One of the most influential books in the last couple of decades was by Diana Lorelei, somebody who's been mentioned at the conference a number of times. I think it was first authored in 1993. This is the second edition up on the screen, Rethinking University Teaching. And in that book, Diana proposed this conversational model of teaching and learning. And there's an embarrassingly simplified version of that model up on the screen, where it really starts with a teacher presenting some sort of material, some sort of design, some sort of artefact out to the student, and then the learner reflects, in number 2 there, reflects on whatever the teacher has said and processes it, and then presents some sort of meaning back to the lecturer or the teacher, and then the teacher reflects on that. And this cycle is an iterative cycle of conversation that goes around and around in this mutual meaning-making process. So that's sort of one take on teacher-learner interaction. If we think about learner interaction, we start to bring out some pretty big guns in educational psychology and education generally. So social learning theories, many of you would be familiar with Vygotsky, and Vygotsky and Piaget have slightly different views on the value of interaction, but both recognise the value of learner-learner interaction and collaboration in the teaching and learning process. So from Vygotsky's point of view, when you're involved in collaborative work, there is this co-construction of knowledge, and then through that process of conversation, there's within the individual some sort of reciprocal sense-making goes on. Piaget has a slightly different view where it's through the conversation or the interaction between two people. Often there's some sort of conflict that emerges, and through those two different perspectives, the individual will start to assimilate and accommodate different perspectives, which leads to cognitive change, which leads to meaning-making. And the third of these areas, the learner-content interaction, is certainly something that our field or our community has had a lot to say about for many, many years. So researchers and practitioners in our field, from video discs to interactive multimedia, to emerging social media of today, have always been interested in the idea about the way in which students particularly, or learners, engage with content, and the way in which media affords particular types of interactions in order for the students to learn something through their engagement. And when I first started getting interested in this area, which seems like a long time ago now, I was very struck by Thompson and Jorgensen, who proposed some sort of this framework, which is a continuum, as they put it, from a reactive end to the proactive end. And down at the reactive end, we've got basically a behaviourist, instructivist, drill and practice type model. And down the other end of the spectrum, we have what is called proactive, which is more in the constructivist line of thinking, with students who are exploring and discovering. And in the middle of this continuum is the interactive, which is, from Thompson and Jorgensen's point of view, is taking a little bit of both sides of the continuum. So there's a little bit of instruction, there's a little bit of exploration, a little bit of instruction, a little bit of exploration. Now, if we fast forward a little bit, the S has dropped off transactions. Schreier and Mischenschuck in 1993 had another continuum, again reactive, proactive, and then mutual. They also had functions and transactions, which I won't talk about in their framework. But with the idea of mutual interactivity, the idea there was that students, when engaging with an interactive learning system, the system would mutually adapt to the individual, and the individual would adapt to the system. And this is really, I think, one of the nice examples or characterisations of what we really think of as adaptive computing in a learning context, so that this is where students really do provide some input into the system, and the system starts to understand where they're coming from and will adapt the instruction to them. And in our 30th year celebration, it's important to acknowledge the work of Rod Sims, somebody who's not in the room, I don't think, unless he arrived quite recently. But Rod did some work in 94 and 97, and his Forgotten Art paper from 97 is cited over 280 times. And again, when I was starting out, I was very influenced by Rod and how he characterised the idea about students manipulating and changing and interacting with the interface in educational media. He came up with 7 levels of interactivity in 1994 and 10 interactive concepts in 97. So when you reflect on those sort of taxonomies, particularly those last ones in the area of learner-content interaction, but also the other ones which are more people-based interaction, it does remind us that one of the important aspects of what we do in a field is design interaction. I mean, useful and wonderful interactions occur in informal ways in learning environments that are unplanned, that are serendipitous. But a lot of what we do as educators and designers and researchers is design interactions. We think very carefully about how we can create learning environments that try to promote these types of interactions. And of course, the things that we draw on in promoting those kind of interactions are the kinds of models and frameworks and theories that I mentioned before. So we sort of get to this sort of opening part of the presentation and responding to this question about how well are we designing interactions. And what I've done, hopefully, is sort of outline some idea about what interactions are. I've given you really snapshots of a couple of models as to why people think they're important in enhancing and supporting teaching and learning. I've made an argument that these things can happen spontaneously, but a lot of what we do is design them. And what I want to spend the most of my talk on is really interrogating the question about, well, how well are we doing this as a community, and thinking about the present. And in a way, this is an awfully impossible question, of course. How are we, big community here, lots of people, how are we as educational technology practitioners designing or doing interaction? And it does remind me of, I cornered Ron Oliver at a conference a couple of years ago and asked him, how well or what universities were doing educational technology well. And Ron sort of paused for a while and he said, I can think of subjects or programs or units that are using technology well, and I can certainly think of individuals who are doing technology well, but I can't really think of a university that it's doing well. So here I am trying to characterise the whole of Australasia. Anyway, one way to start and think about this question is to think about educational technology movements that we've seen over the recent past. And don't get too fussed about the dates here. They're sort of indicative, if anything, and we can argue about that in question time if you want to. But these interactive multimedia, moving to learning management systems, moving to the social media, and then moving to mobile learning represent something of shifts in educational technology movements over the last 10 to 15 years. And in many ways, these technologies represent the core technologies of what we use in common practice today. And one way in which we can start to think about how we're doing with educational technology interaction is to overlay the types of interactions that I was talking about before, teacher-learner, learner-learner, and learner content, and build this sort of matrix, this sort of table. And this is where, before sort of going on, I'll introduce a couple of disclaimers. The first disclaimer is that it really makes little sense to evaluate how we're doing educational technology if you don't think about the learning design associated with the interactions between the columns and the cells on the table. You've got to think about the specific learning designs and how they're enacted within each of these little environments. So that's my first disclaimer. Don't worry, there's a second disclaimer as well. The second disclaimer is it's rare, of course, for these kind of technologies on the left-hand side of the slide to be used in sort of isolation. Often what we do is we build some sort of educational technology program, but then we complement that with other either educational technology or offline kind of educational activities, or we compensate for what's lost in the technology in a face-to-face environment. So what I'm really saying is that we're often operating in blended learning environments where one takes some role, some sort of form of instruction takes some role, and another form of instruction takes another role. But leaving those disclaimers aside, I can think of really good examples, as I'm sure you all can, of the ways in which, through our history, we've thought well and designed well educational technology interactions. So I remember when I first started out, and I think it was mentioned earlier, the Wollongong group investigating Lake Aluka was an amazing discovery-based learning program on CD-ROM that was developed by the Wollongong group when they were really at the top of their game, and it was very much learner content interaction through interactive multimedia. I also remember a good mate of mine, Matt Riddle, was working in the law school at Melbourne University, and he developed a role-play game for law students where they were meant to investigate law problems. They did small group work. The lecturer acted as the partner in the law firm to provide them with advice. Very nice design. It was sort of pre-LMS. And then within learning management systems, I remember a group from Monash University that had a similar sort of role-play game where students were asked to think about a patient, and then through small group they were meant to take the role of a clinician, the role of a nurse, the role of the patient themselves, the role of the parent, and the role of the school liaison officer over a 12-week course. The idea, in order to understand the patient condition, you needed to understand different roles in the way in which care was provided. Sue Bennett, as part of our Net Generation project, introduced a lovely learning design associated with journalism students and blogging tools, where students were asked to create blog posts as a very relevant thing for journalism students to think about alternative ways to provide stories, and that they were shared between teachers and students. And Barney Delgado and Andrew Bishop at Charles Sturt University had a nice mobile application where students in remote areas and also local areas were asked to photograph bug specimens and then share them up online through a learning management system, creating a nice community. And they looked at morphology and taxonomy associated with morphology. So I suppose what I'm saying is that in the history that we have had, we can all point to examples, and what I did before coming to the conference is look at the ASCILITE website and looked at all the examples of the awards that had been given to members of our community, and I think that they provide examples of how you could fill in this table. So we get to this point of the presentation and hopefully everybody's feeling happy, everyone's feeling good, we've got good examples of what we're doing. And here's where I want to take an alternative view and move away a bit from the electric dream and maybe move a little bit towards the nightmare on Elm Street. So the alternative argument about the way in which we've been using technology and our current use of technology is that it's really failed to live up to its promise. Educational technology in general terms has not revolutionised or fundamentally transformed teaching, learning and assessment. And in more specific terms, we've not done a particularly good job at using technology in systemic ways to enhance and support learning interactions. So, why would I say this? Why would I be so hurtful? Why would I be so mean? Well, let me try and explain. This is a framework that I've used with staff at the University of Melbourne, which has been quite useful, and it outlines 4 ways in which we use technology in higher education. And we use technology for the management and administration of teaching and learning. We use learning management systems to organise students into groups and coordinate activities for students and staff. We're very good at using technology for access, which is quadrant 2, so the delivery of educational technology resources to students and students' provision of resources or essays or whatever it is back to us. One of the things that we do is where in the past we might have photocopied a book of readings and made it available in the library and asked students to pay $5 to it. Now we'll shove it up online, students will access it, and that's one of the boons of technology and one of the ways in which we've made it work in our favour. The 4th quadrant is scholarly inquiry and research. In both undergraduate and graduate programs, students are routinely asked to undertake inquiries as part of their studies. And in a way, they're hand-forced by Google and Wikipedia. Libraries have really changed the way in which they operate, and also their hand being forced by publishing companies who've gone online. And libraries have moved to an information commons sort of model where they are changing the way in which they use technology to provide resources to students. And in a way, I think that those first 3 quadrants, quadrant 1, 2 and 4, we've done quite a good job in. But what I'm less sure about is how we're using technology to support genuine, generative, interactive teaching, learning and assessment. This is the money quadrant, this is the thing that technology is sold on. If you go out to the vendors' stands, a lot of the imagery, a lot of the iconography, a lot of the argument in their literature would be about genuine, interactive teaching, learning and assessment. And my argument is that I don't think we've done a particularly good job with that. We fall short on quadrant 3. Quadrant 3 is hard. It's hard to do across a range of contexts, across a range of curricula, across a range of disciplines for different learning outcomes. It often requires time and effort and is often more expensive than the other quadrants, and that makes it hard to do. So we get to the end, and it's not just me really that is saying this. So again, two fairly well-known names in the field, in Gregor and Neil, where Gregor said in 2004, the reality is that e-learning is still marginal in the lives of most academics, with technology being used for little more than acting as a content repository or for administration purposes. Where Neil said the formal use of computer technologies in many areas of higher education could be best described as sporadic, uneven, and often at low level. So the point of the story is the way in which we're using technology is often for access, for enabling people to get access to resources and to download those resources, and for the management of the teaching and learning process and the administration of the teaching and learning process, but not particularly for interaction. And this is sort of odd in a way, because somewhat incongruously, as we've moved from the way in which we use technology, at the same time we've seen a rise since the 60s and 70s for more student-centred models of teaching and learning. So, as many of you would know and be fully aware of, the philosophies that we use in teaching and learning have moved away from the didactic instruction, lecturing, large groups, the kind of thing that I'm doing now, those kind of philosophies and frameworks of teaching and learning, towards more student-centred models where we privilege small group work, inquiry-based work, peer-based collaboration, and authentic. So on the one hand, we're using technology in a particular way, but our philosophies of teaching and learning are telling us that we should be using it in a different way. But the news, I want to argue, gets a little bit worse. In our genuine commitment to the right-hand side of the slide, we've created, in a way, I think, another kind of problem. So we've moved and we've swung the pendulum and we've gravitated towards student-centred models of teaching and learning. But in that gravitation towards student-centred learning, I think that we've, in fact, overemphasised the idea of students' peer interactions and overemphasised the idea of interaction with content, and we've underemphasised interaction with teachers. So in a way, what I'm arguing is that we've swung the pendulum too far. Did you like that animation? I mean, I don't know how long I spent doing this talk, but I reckon half of it was on that animation. Should I leave now? Get going now. So I'm not sure what's happening with these slides. So in our pursuit of student-centred approaches, I think that we've sort of swung the pendulum too far, and I want to talk a little bit about why I would say that. So in going back to the Deering report in 1997, people may know the Deering report. It was a big report that looked about, in the UK context, that sought to look at the future of higher education in the current policy cycle, the way in which technology was rising at that time, and sought to make predictions or suggestions about what should be happening in the UK system. It's sort of like the Bradley Review in Australia that was a couple of years ago now. And I think that thanks to Martin Oliver from the UK, who pointed me to this when I was talking to him about what I might say today, where he pointed me to this sort of appendix of the report, where it was sort of, and I think this quote is quite telling, because it's saying, in the future, many staff would seek to spend some of their time in the development of learning materials because these will enshrine the core of their teaching. Enshrine the core of their teaching. And I think that that's a really interesting way to put it. It's sort of spiritual. It's sort of a call to arms. In the thoughtful development of learning materials, we can enshrine good teaching. There's a strong sort of belief in the statement that perhaps the principles of good teaching and even the teacher can somehow be captured by good educational design in the media. By articulating the parameters of the teaching and learning structure and good teaching and learning, we can somehow capture the role of the teacher in the media. And I think it's just interesting to reflect on that. And if we fast forward from the Deering report to the contemporary Australian context, and how we can sort of look at another example of how the pendulum has perhaps swung too far, as most universities, regardless of their flavour, move to wholly online education. And there is a gravitation towards this model of teaching and learning. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation, this diagram. I'm going to leave the learner content interaction. I don't know if there are any skiers in the room. There's probably some skiers in the room. I'm not a skier, but I took my kids on sort of that flip line, or whatever they're called, zip line, flying fox things, and I was struck by the diamond black run, which are the hardest runs, and then there's blue runs, which are sort of medium runs, and then there's green runs, which are sort of easy runs. And I'm going to use that iconography of black run, blue run, green run. I'm also going to use the people thing to talk about scalability, and I'm going to use the dollar signs to represent, strangely enough, dollars. And what I want to argue is that people-based interaction, teacher-learner interaction, and learner-learner interaction can be synchronous and asynchronous. And in our move towards wholly online learning, I think that what universities are struggling with is how to make interactions work online, and they've struggled with this for some time. So teacher-learner interaction, I would argue, are quite difficult to create online. They're not particularly scalable, and they are quite costly. Similarly, with teacher-learner interaction in asynchronous mode, they're maybe a little bit easier to create, but they're still not particularly scalable, and they're still quite expensive. If we move to synchronous learner-learner interaction, they're moderately easy to create, they're a little bit more scalable, and they're a little less expensive. But really, the easiest one to create, the one that's most scalable, and the one that's arguably less expensive, is of course asynchronous learner-learner interactions. And I think that, in a way, quite reasonably, universities and people who are designing online learning environments are gravitating towards this quadrant, because in sort of operational and functional ways, it's the easiest one to do. It's the one that's least tricky, it's the one that's scalable, and it's the one that's cost-effective. So I think that that's worth thinking about when I'm thinking about this pendulum swinging too far and where is the teacher. Maybe in online learning we're gravitating towards that quadrant. And not to push the 80s theme too far, but if I was to be a bit cynical about this, there's a little bit of Wall Street in it all. There's a little bit of Gordon Gekko, there's a little bit of greed is good, because of course you're likely to make money in that quadrant. And where is the teaching? Just to reflect on a conversation that I had in the coffee queue at a conference recently, I think that this is a typical kind of conversation. I was sitting there and somebody said to me, I just finished my Masters in Information Science at University of whatever, and I said, oh, that's great, you know, you must be really pleased to get it all done. And she said, oh yeah, it was great, I studied at night, it was incredibly convenient. And then there was this pause, and then she looked me in the eye and she said, but basically I taught myself. And I think that we've got to think about that, about in the peer networked learning, about the role of the teacher. So to bring all this together, my wife pointed me to this story in the Monthly, which is an obituary of an educator at the University of Melbourne, a guy called Peter Steele, who'd been around for a long time. The obituary was written by a guy called Raymond Gator, who's a professor of philosophy at the Australian Catholic University. And I was just struck by this quote. And this is Gator speaking. Steele abhorred, so Steele's the guy in the picture, Steele abhorred the spreading notion that teachers merely put into the heads of students what, in principle, they could have got elsewhere. The concept is now ubiquitous, which is why we hear so much about learning, capital intended, but so little about teaching. So his argument, Gator's argument, as I interpret it, is that teachers are not just content providers, and they're not just traffic cops directing students to excellent resources that are available on the web. Teachers and teaching is so much more than that. It's inspiring students, it's understanding where they're at, it's coaching them, it's guiding them, it's asking them to articulate, it's listening to them, it's reflecting on them, it's instilling in them some sort of passion for the discipline, which the teacher themselves has a passion for. So in bringing this argument together, just before I go on, what I was struck by this was that what Gator was saying is that in no uncertain terms that our education system at the moment, is at risk of marginalising teachers and the process, the activity and the profession of teaching in our current system. And I think that bears thinking about. So to bring all this together, if we take these sort of two slightly incongruous arguments, on the one hand, our contemporary use of educational technologies have generally failed to transform our teaching and learning practice, and more specifically, they're not particularly good at interaction. They've emphasised content provision, they've emphasised access, they've emphasised management. So that's one side of the argument. And on the other side of the argument, the contemporary tilt towards student-centred approaches to learning has perhaps tilted too far, is that we've emphasised peer-based interaction and interaction with content, and in doing so, we've partially marginalised the teachers. So, are we intentionally, or unintentionally, or even intentionally, designing out the teacher? It's almost like we've changed the status of teaching. We've moved teachers... Most people are happy with this first bit, from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. But perhaps we're moving them to just being another pleb on the web. So, to return to the question, how well are we designing technology-based learning experiences? And to return to the matrix. So remember the disclaimers and remember the examples. But my view of the current use of educational technology, seen through the lens of interaction, is that we've invested particularly well in the right-hand side, in the right column. With learner content interaction, we've done particularly well in the rise of educational multimedia and interactive CD-ROMs, and there's great examples of that. So I think that the leader really is interactive multimedia, which focuses on interactive and adaptive learning experiences. The others, like learning management systems and mobile learning, can do not a bad job in this, but are probably a little bit more muted. And social media, as the definition sort of suggests, or the name suggests, is more about people-people interaction, although there could be content-based interaction. When we move to learner-learner interaction, we've also done reasonably well. I think that social media is arguably at the top of the pops here, but if you really pushed me on it, 3 stars is probably... 3 stars, I feel like the movie show. 3 stars is probably a bit overzealous. I think that, and if you read some of the EDUCAUSE reports, a lot of the interactions that students are having that are mediated by technology are done within learning management systems through discussion lists, or outside learning management systems with fairly traditional media such as email. So learning management systems and through discussion lists, as I say, and mobile learning are another example of where learner-learner interaction. And it's finally in the area of teacher-learner interactions, it's no surprise probably, given to what I've said so far, is this is the area where I think that we haven't used technology to its greatest advantage. While the use of the LMS and social media have been used to promote this kind of interaction, that is teacher-learner interaction, I'm not sure that we've really captured effective, systemic, widespread use of technology to support teacher-learning interaction. So we get to this point of the conversation, and it's always the point of the conversation where you sort of say, well, so what? Who cares? Does it really matter? And to a certain extent, if you follow the work of someone like Terry Anderson and you buy the equivalency theory of interaction, then you say it doesn't really matter. You know, that what that theory says is that regardless of the flavour of the interaction, teacher-student, student content, and student-student, as long as there's some of it there, it doesn't really matter what kind of interaction there is. And student learning doesn't suffer. But I sort of want to disagree with that, and I want to say that it does matter. And I want to give you a couple of reasons why I think it matters. And so the first one is that teaching is important, and I think it's important, and a lot of the empirical literature would suggest that it is important. Many of you would be aware of Bloom's study in 1984, where what Bloom did was basically looked at conventional teaching, which is 1 staff member to 30 students in a classroom, teach them over a 12-week period and then summatively assess them at the end. Pitted that against mastery learning, which is basically the same setup, 1 to 30, but had formative assessment over the course of the instructional period before a summative assessment. And then the final category is one-on-one or one-on-two tutorial, which was intensive, 1-to-1, formative and summative. And what Bloom established was that there was such an incredible advantage from that one-on-one tutoring system, particularly compared to the conventional approach. The paper's called the 2 sigma effect, which is a 2 standard deviation effect, highly significant impact of that kind of instruction compared to conventional instruction. The second thing that I want to highlight is John Hattie, whose work has been mentioned before at the conference. John Hattie's well known particularly for the schools-based research as far as I can tell. And, you know, there's papers that I've read of John's where he says 30% of the variance in the outcome of school-age students in terms of their learning outcome is accounted for by the teacher. And so I asked him and I said, you know, what about the higher education sector? And he said, and I quote, you know, that the teacher is the largest source of variance that we have any control over in higher education. And he pointed me to this study, which is 800 meta-analytic studies. So he's got a big group of studies which he's trawled through to come up with this statement. So he's basically arguing very strongly for the impact of teaching on students' learning outcomes. And the final dot point there is a little bit of an odd one. It's an argument that teaching is important because teaching within a discipline is important. And Beecher and Trollo, the academic tribes and territories, while they don't speak particularly about teaching and learning, they certainly make a strong argument about disciplines having their own cultures, their own knowledge structures, their own epistemologies. And the part of the teaching and learning process is to inculcate students in the understanding of that discipline and the epistemologies within that discipline, or the knowledge structures within that discipline. And many of you will be aware of the TPAC model, and with technological, pedagogical and content knowledge, there's a little bit of that in the TPAC model as well, the idea that discipline is important when teaching students. The second reason that teaching matters is something to do with scaffolding, and this is a related question to the first point. But there's 2 studies that you should read if you haven't read them, one by Richard E. Mayer, the other by Kirshner, Sweller and Clark, that came out in 2.4 and 2.6 that were really a reaction against student-centred modes of teaching and learning, that they saw this rise of student-centred modes and particularly inquiry-based and discovery-based learning. So the titles of the papers are indicative of their content. Should there be a 3 strikes rule against pure discovery learning, and why minimal guidance during instruction does not work? These guys are not subtle about where they're coming from. So that these papers really trawled through, particularly the Mayer paper, trawled through 30 years of research and made very strong theoretical and then empirical arguments as to why we can't leave students by their lonesome in pure discovery-based learning environments. They argued very strongly about the role of the teacher and the expert in providing guidance to students within those discovery-based environments, finding the right points in time to help students along, to direct them, to provide them with advice and to provide them with instruction. So they're the first 2 arguments. And I'm not saying here, or I'm not suggesting by any means, that peer-based learning or self-directed learning is not important. They are important. But peer-based learning, when you look at it, and this is, in a way, the top of the slide is a reflection, or the other side of the coin to the bottom of the slide here. Peer-based learning is somewhat haphazard. And we know from research that students often want, but are unsure of, particularly in pure discovery, peer-based learning environments, what the content expertise and who the known authority is at some points in time they want to know what the discipline is and where they're headed in it. And similarly, in self-directed learning environments, we've got to be very careful not to just throw students out into these pure discovery learning environments and allow them to explore and self-direct, and give them, as they say, enough rope to hang themselves. I was very struck by Keith Brennan's blog post, and I direct you to it. It's called "In Connectivism, No One Can Hear You Scream." I just love that title. Where Keith really makes a quite strong argument, and an amusing argument, and a well-thought-out argument, how students are often in connectivist learning environments, often lost, they're often unsupported, and they're often not learning particularly well online. So I want to round out the presentation by thinking about the technologies of the present day and looking forward. So you can't have a presentation, I don't think, without talking about MOOCs, the flipped classroom, and learning analytics. And I just want to reflect a little bit on these contemporary technologies given the structure of the presentation that I've put together. So if we think about MOOCs, I think the cat's out of the bag a little bit on MOOCs, that they're fairly old world online learning. They're fairly traditional, particularly ex-MOOCs, depends again on the learning design, but fairly traditional 1998 online learning type situation. So if we apply our metrics or our estimations of what kind of interactions happen in there, the learner-content interaction can be quite good. The learner-learner interaction is somewhat muted, and almost by design at the scale and the philosophy that underpins MOOCs, there's not too much teacher-learner interaction. Just on the learner-learner interaction for some of our MOOCs, so that macroeconomics is one of our MOOCs, which has got 26,000 students who were active across the 8 weeks of the course, we found that less than 5% participated in the discussion list. So 95% are not getting into the learner-learner interaction, which is one of the philosophies that underpins this. I've separated out the flipped classroom and learning analytics because I don't see them as educational technologies per se. I'm not quite sure how to characterise them, but I've just pulled them out. But regardless, the flipped classroom idea, this idea of taking the lecture material that you're giving to students, finding some way to provide it to students beforehand, often through technological means, often by putting it up on the web and getting them to engage with that or cover that or, pardon me, look at that before they come to class, and then freeing up the hour that you have with students so that you can do something more interactive and engaging. I think that this model shows great promise in higher education generally, and certainly educational technology field particularly. When done well, you can provide good, highly interactive content to students beforehand, and then free up your time for peer-based interactions either online before the class or within the class, and teacher-student interactions either online or in the class. And the final area of learning analytics, which again is not an educational technology per se, I think that first column out to the right-hand side on learner content interaction, learning analytics is built on a tradition really of, a long tradition of intelligent tutoring systems, of adaptive computing systems, of interactivity research. And I think that the value of learning analytics at the moment is in that idea of adaptive computing and where it's going to be targeted. I think the promise of learning analytics, which is right, it's represented in that sort of red colour, is the ability to take data out of systems and then provide it back to teachers and students, that then that analysis or that data forms the basis of ongoing interactions. And that's really the future. So as I wind up, I think that it's pretty important to acknowledge the elephant in the room. I love this cartoon. I'm right there in the room and no one even acknowledges me. The poor elephant. The elephant in the room is this, which is not dissimilar to this. So, you know, the reality is that we are operating in a mass education system. We've got more students than we ever had in the system, and often this is the way in which we choose or are forced to teach them. And so I think that we need to avoid the illusion that we're in some sort of Oxbridge model of teaching and learning where we've got Bloom's one-on-one tutorial system. I think that we need to make sure that we're not duped into thinking that that's the way in which we operate. In most cases, it doesn't exist, and it's another type of dream. But having said that, it would be the point of the story, the point of my story, is not about some comparison of face-to-face versus online. I don't want you to leave the talk thinking that it's about something like that. If you do leave, that sort of misses the point. The point is that regardless of the mode of instruction, regardless of whether we're on campus face-to-face or online, is that we need to think about privileging and emphasising high-quality learning interactions. And my argument, particularly, we need to privilege learner-teacher interactions, regardless of the study mode. So I want to conclude and give us a little bit of time for questions. So I've argued that high-quality interaction is important in student learning, and I've also been at pains to point out that there's some great examples from our history and from our current day, if you look through the program of this week's conference, ways in which we use technology to promote and support beneficial teaching and learning interactions. But my argument is also that our design and use of technology in tertiary education is often done without explicitly having interaction, particularly teacher-student interactions, in mind. And it's almost like we've got some sort of step-down hierarchy of the way in which we use technology. On the first step, we've got access and delivery, shortly followed by management and administration. We're not too bad at provision of interactive content. We do peer-based interaction, and on the bottom step, I think, comes teacher-learner interaction. In our current use of technology, there's the technological side of the argument and the pedagogical side of the argument. We've overemphasised student-centred learning, and that has meant the risk that we're sidestepping teachers and the important process of teaching. And whatever technology artefacts or whatever peers exist, network peers exist in the learning system, it's difficult for me to dream, at least, that we can learn online without a teacher. So my job was to try and understand the present, and I've tried to understand the present through the lens of interactions. And in a way, for me, the challenge remains as it has always been, and that is to design meaningful, high-quality learning interactions to support students' learning. So, in many ways, I think that this is a recurring dream. It's one of our most enduring dreams. It's a recurring electronic dream. It's not a nightmare, I don't think, by any means, but it's a dream that we certainly revisit, and we should revisit it, to check ourselves, to see where we're at with learning technology interactions and where we're headed. So I look forward to tomorrow's keynote, which is about the future and where we're headed, and thanks very much for listening. What are you laughing at?
We do have time for a few questions, and gee, if you haven't got any questions after that, there's something wrong. So I can see up the back. We've got someone who can run.
I'm going to put up the image credits, just so that you know I didn't flog everything from the image. Now I'm going to take them away.
Thanks. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. Sorry if this is a bit incoherent question, but I really enjoyed your presentation.
Good.
Thanks. And I suppose this thought comes from my perspective as a recent graduate student and now in a postgraduate course. And what I think is really interesting is that you mentioned the importance now of looking at the teacher-student interaction. And with all the kind of technological kind of like changes and kind of excitement that's happening, like you've said, there's a lot of focus on, say, the ed tech design and all this kind of whiz-bang stuff. But it also provides an opportunity for teachers, current teachers, to also shift or reevaluate their own teaching styles, because it feels like, I think like with most things, there's like a normal distribution of people in the field where, you know, just from personal experience, I've had teachers that are extraordinary, teachers that are just normal, and then teachers that I'm afraid are kind of like near the lower end of the spectrum, where it's kind of like
Yep.
it feels like they don't really want to be
Yep.
there. And what do you think about the status of teacher training and how academics who are actually teaching, like why they're actually there sometimes?
Yeah, it's
Like
a good
that kind
question.
of-
I mean, I think
No
I agree.
offence.
I mean, I agree with you about it's like the technology adoption curve that we'd all know about the early adopters down to the laggards. And part of the argument that I was making is that we haven't had a systemic-wide change in our field and across universities, and that gets to the core of professional development of staff, and it's really tricky. And I can only really go on what we're doing at the University of Melbourne, which is with Linda Corrin and myself have developed a professional development framework that is explicitly targeted at not the front end of the curve. I think that the early innovators and the early adopters are the easy wins, really, for our area, is that they're the people that are the keen beans, they're prepared to do it at night and on the weekends, and they're prepared to adopt technology to affect change. The hard bit is the hitting zone. I sort of argue, and don't say this to anyone outside the room, I sort of argue that the laggards, you're often not going to reach them unless the whole institution goes. So your hitting zone is the middle bit. And so what Linda and I have done is developed a professional development framework with 14 activities that explicitly targets the middle bit. We don't ignore the front end and we don't quite ignore the back end, but we target the middle bit to try and get small change and small levels of innovation, which is often with established learning systems like Echo 360 and the learning management system and plagiarism, and think about ways in which you can have small changes in learning designs for those systems with small amounts of money attached. And in that way, you shift the whole technology adoption curve. But I think it's a classic issue for our area, which is professional development of staff.
Thank you. That was a brilliant presentation, very captivating.
You were also quiet.
Going back to the Deering report, and you mentioned enshrining the values of our teaching. The biggest change since Deering has been the commercialisation of education.
The what?
Commercialisation. And the Red report demonstrated that over 60% of all teaching across the sector is done by casual teachers. The issue of, therefore, valuing teaching and enabling teachers to develop educationally sound and pedagogical environments when they are struggling to go from session to session is perhaps one of the biggest challenges we're facing. And the current technologies, in a sense, enable us all to commoditise ourselves, to enshrine somehow or other the kind of work we do so that we can take it with us from institution to institution. What are your comments on, what's the issue here when we cannot provide continuous employment for our teachers?
Again, I think a really good question and goes to the heart of the matter of a broader sector-wide issue about sessionalisation of teaching. And there's two issues for me in this. It relates to the professional development question, but there's two issues in here. One is the general value of teaching, and there's quite a long-standing, certainly since I've been in the area, conversation about in the university sector in Australia particularly, which I feel comfortable talking about, the relationship between research and the value of research and the value of teaching, and a constant struggle to try and up the value of teaching. The second issue is the casualisation of the workforce and the sessional staff. And I don't think that there's a magic bullet here other than to try, there's two things that I would say, to build professional development frameworks within universities that try to recognise explicitly the nature of the workforce. Now, that doesn't solve the problem of the casualisation of the workforce, and that's a bigger issue associated with federal funding models. And then the second thing is that whether or not, dare I say it, something like OLT or TEXA has a responsibility or a role in providing resources, structure and support to ensure that people feel that they're supported, even if they're in a situation where they're casual teachers. But I don't think the broader question about, as you say, the commoditisation and what frankly is federal public money being taken out of the educational system as it moves to be more corporatised and privatised in the rise of the enterprise university. I don't think that the things that I've spoken about there are in any way going to touch that broader socio-political issue. I know that's sort of a fudge, but that's my best go. Yep. You might have to turn the mic on.